Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to do a review of the new Samyang Rokinon 21mm f1.4, that's ED-AS-UMC. ED standing for the extra low dispersion element, and then AS standing for an spherical element. Then finally UMC stands for ultra multi-coating, which is the Rokinon Samyang designation for their lens coatings that are on the lens. So this, of course, as a 21mm focal length, and if you're accustomed to looking at full frame focal lengths, 21mm might be a little bit odd. The one that I can think of right now offhand is Zeiss does make a 21mm for full frame. But this, of course, is for mirrorless bodies and specifically for either APS-C or crop sensors and micro four thirds. And so this lens is sold in, and I'm reviewing on a Canon EF-M mount, and that's for the M series of cameras. This is an M3 body that I'm using. And it's also available in a Sony and Fuji mount, and that's a Sony E mount and a Fuji X mount, and then also micro four thirds. And so, of course, the actual full frame equivalency of this 21mm lens depends on the crop factor of your camera. Here on this Canon, it is 33.6mm equivalent. On a Fuji or a Sony E mount, it's 31.5mm. And then, of course, the 2 times crop factor of micro four thirds means that it's a 42mm on a micro four thirds sensor. That being said, on all of these, of course, it is an f1.4, and that makes it a special lens. It has a very wide aperture and, of course, a very, very effective focal length, whatever it may be, in a very nicely compact body. To give you an idea of the overall dimensions, it's pretty similar in size to probably most of the kit lenses that you might use. Here on this Canon M body, I've got the 18 to 55mm, and as you can see in the retracted form, it's about the same length. Of course, difference being that the zoom lens does extend out when it is zoomed. But this is a very nice size for such a large aperture lens, and so overall, to give you an idea, the weight will come in at anywhere between 275 and 290 grams, depending on your actual lens mount and build, and so that's between, you know, roughly 9 to 10 ounces. Its overall length is about 2.65 inches, and there's a little variance there again depending on the flange distance of your mount, and are about 67mm long. So a really nicely compact size, and we've already talked about some of those exotic elements that are part of the formula, but overall there are 8 elements in 7 groups that make up the optical formula. And of course, one very nice thing that I've detailed in my build quality or first look video, which if you haven't seen, take a look at that here. And in that, I detailed that it also has a 9-bladed aperture. And in our second video of this series, where we looked at the overall image quality and bokeh from the lens, and if you haven't seen that, you could check that video out here. We discovered that it has a 9-bladed rounded blade aperture. And so as you stop it down, the aperture circle remains nicely circular shaped, and so you get nice bokeh highlights even when you stop down the lens a fair bit. The flip side of that, of course, unlike the 12mm f2 lens that's from the same line that I own and I highly recommend it, and a lot of you have written back in the year and a half or so since I posted that review of how much you enjoy the lens yourself. But the one thing that I kind of knocked on the image quality was that when stopped down, you know, f8 through f16, we're getting a nice sunburst effect when you have the sun or a light source in the frame, that its sunbursts were kind of boring looking. It had a 6-bladed aperture, of course, that didn't do quite the same thing. Fortunately, here we've got a 9-bladed aperture that is much more appealing and produces very nice sun stars when it's when the lens is stopped down and the sun's in the frame like that. Now this lens will focus down to about 12 inches. That's roughly right around 0.28 meters. And so by my calculation, it provides roughly somewhere around a 0.20 or 0.21 times maximum magnification, which isn't class leading, but it's certainly a very useful figure. It enables you to get nice and close to your subject and to really throw backgrounds out of focus, particularly at that wide f1.4 aperture. At the front, you'll find that it has a 58 millimeter front filter thread, which of course is a very common, easy to find 58 filter, and typically not expensive. And 58 millimeter is shared with a number of other lenses. But on that note, let me kind of just go on a quick rant, and that is that out of the 8 mirrorless lenses that I have reviewed, 7 of those have a different front filter size. So only 2 of them out of 8 share any kind of front filter size. And so it seems to me that unlike SLR lenses, which tend to conform for the most part to a few standard sizes, you know, 67 millimeters, 72 millimeters, 77 millimeters, those are very, very common, and you will find often that you can share filters amongst a lot of them. These lenses for mirrorless bodies, they don't seem to ascribe to any kind of standard, and they really are all over the map. And so as a result, I find it hard to share filters, and so it means that you're looking at either using a step-up ring. If you're not familiar with that, it's just a little ring that goes in there to change the front filter size to expand out. But of course the problem is that if you're using the lens hood, and Rokinon Samyang has included a nice little pedal-shaped lens hood, and so you might as well use it. It means that often you're restricted from using your lens hood, so you have to choose between using filters or using your lens hood. And so the only other, of course, result is where you're left basically buying new filters for every one of these lenses. And so I wish that they would go to a standard. Now, before I hit some of the good stuff here, let me just detail some of the quirks in using lenses like this. Number one, I've already noted, as I looked at some user reviews out there, people saying this lens doesn't work on, for example, a Canon M3 body. That's not true. Of course, it works just fine, but remember that there is no electronic coupling here, or any kind of electronic sensor here at the rear mount of the lens. And so as a result, even though it's physically mounted to your camera, because there's no electronic communication, your camera doesn't necessarily know that a lens is there. And so as a result, and this is, I'm sure, the issue that the user found, that the camera won't take a picture because it doesn't sense that there is a lens there. So what you've got to do is to go into the menus of your camera and make sure that you enable a setting that will enable the shutter to release when no lens is attached. Not because you want to shoot with no lens on there, but rather because you want to be able to mount lenses like this, or if you've used any kind of vintage glass on there. So that is one of the quirks that comes with having no electronic coupling. Now, the bigger issue to me is that while this doesn't affect metering or anything like that, I mean, the light still enters the camera in the same way as it does through any other lens. And so when it comes to metering is fine, and you know, of course, you can see what the lens sees, all of that stuff. So that's not really an issue. But what is an issue is that no electronic data is communicated to the actual camera body. And so anything that is counted for by the camera body, say your shutter speed or your ISO setting, that will show up in the EXIF data when you import the images. But it won't tell you anything about the focal length of the lens. But as a byproduct of this, it means that neither the camera body nor your processing software, for example, I use Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw for Photoshop, and neither one of those pieces of software will detect what the lens actually is. And so as a result, you can forget about having any kind of standard profile to correct vignette and chromatic aberration automatically for the lens or distortion. The upside, I guess, when it comes to this lens is that all of those things are actually quite low. There is a bit of vignette wide open, but compared to a lot of other lenses that I've looked at, it's actually quite minimal, and as a result, I haven't found it to be an objectionable part of my workflow, despite there not being an automatic correction for that. Furthermore, chromatic aberrations are quite well controlled overall. You'll see just a little bit of fringing every now and then, but it's very undetectable for the most part. And also there is minimal, next to no distortion on the lens. And so that's great, and so you don't really have a whole lot to correct for. But you know, I do miss having that EXIF data, and so, for example, using Zeiss lenses that do electronically communicate, it makes that a little bit easier to use as compared to these type lenses. The upside these days, although this lens is manual focus only, and that's certainly a quirk that some of you may not be able to overcome if you're not into manually focusing. The good news is when you jump into mirrorless bodies, they tend to have more manual focus aids than what do the comparative DSLRs for the most part out there. And for example, in this body, number one, you can see true depth of field either in the LCD or in the electronic viewfinder. You can magnify the image and still see true depth of field. You can use focus peaking, which shows some kind of color tone on the part of the image that is in focus. So there are a variety of aids there, and the end result is that I found that my results are quite well focused for the most part with the lens, but that is an acquired technique. Now, as far as the actual handling, as you can see, the focus ring here, it moves quite nicely, and no issue there. It's very nicely damped. It's a pleasure to use. I think the weight on it is just about right. In fact, the overall build of these lenses is really, to me, that they feel quite premium in the way that they're built and that they handle, and so that's very nice. No issue there. There is, of course, a manual aperture ring, and the aperture ring, it clicks along quite nicely and works smoothly. Nothing there. The lens is very flare resistant, and so you don't have to worry about putting the sun in the frame. As I've mentioned, the chromatic aberrations are low. Really, if you don't mind manual focus, this lens is quite a pleasure to use. It manually focuses very nicely. Now let's talk about the price. It's $449 in the US market through B&H Photo, and so that means that it is quite a bit higher than what the 12mm f2 was. And so it seems like Rokinon is testing out a kind of a new price point for these lenses. Now, compared to other comparative lenses in the various mirrorless mounts that this is available for, I would say that overall it is still undercutting the competition for the most part, particularly when it comes to image quality and the aperture size. And on the note of the actual image quality, if you haven't looked at my segment on the image quality, do yourself a favor and look at that, because you will find that the image quality is quite exceptional out of the lens. And so it certainly is able to optically compete with just about everything that I've seen. I mean, it's not a Zeiss Otis level, but it certainly is highly, highly competitive with everything out there, even wide open from f1.4. And I was actually quite surprised to see during that test that this lens wide open was very visibly able to outperform the 22mm f2 lens that I have from Canon. And so even at 1.4 versus f2, this lens was notably sharper and had greater contrast at f1.4 already. So, I mean, it optically has the chops to back up the price point. The one thing you will find is that while there are other lenses that are more expensive than this, they may or may not also include things like autofocus, for example. And so this is a manual focus only lens. But compared to the overall image quality and the build quality, this is not necessarily an overpriced lens. But at the same time, it's not a cheap lens. And Rokinon, Samyang have kind of been known for offering up cheap lenses. And I sense that they're trying to change that perception to just offering up good lenses, howbeit manual focus only. There is also a cine version of this lens that comes with the aperture declicked, and so you can just glide through various apertures, no hard stops. And at the same time, it's also geared already, and so it's set up to be used by focus-driven systems. And it's a pretty appealing option with those great optics and such a compact size for it. For those of us that shoot Canon M, this lens and the new 50mm f1.2, they provide something that Canon shooters simply just haven't had, namely wide aperture, high quality prime lenses in a native EFM mount, which of course means that it's sized for the camera body, and that's great. And so I think that if you've been looking, you have an M, M2, M3, and you've been looking for quality glass to put on it, well, Rokinon Samyang is providing something that hasn't existed previously. So that's certainly a big plus for those of us that shoot Canon. And the image quality here is blowing away basically everything that is in the actual Canon built lenses that are available at this point. And so if I could give you a bottom line on this, I would say that if you are aware of or have dealt with or feel like you're capable of dealing with the various quirks that I've detailed that comes with shooting a manual focus only lens that has no electronic coupling, then I think that you're going to be very, very happy with what you get out of this lens, or I can mention the 50mm f1.2 that I'm also reviewing right now. They really offer up delightful image quality, beautiful build, and a nice compact size that is really a great balance on the various mirrorless bodies out there. And so I'm very happy, very pleased with these lenses, and I think that they offer up a very credible alternative to some of the existing lenses for the various systems. And so if you haven't already, you can look down below. I've got an image gallery of far more images from the lens. There's a link down below. There's also a buying link there, and I would appreciate that if you do choose to buy, that you would use my linkage, as it helps to provide just a little bit something back that helps to fund this channel along with my website, and so I can continue to do these reviews. I'm Dustin Abbott. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Have a great day.